Hi students, I want to talk about Jane Eyre now. We've finished with persuasion and we need to talk about emotion in Jane Eyre and how Charlotte Bronte deals with it. And I think it's very interesting, the motif, a very famous motif that we start with is Jane hiding behind a curtain, enjoying her pleasures in reading. And I think this is symbolic of how women in this time period had to hide their pleasure, had to hide their feelings, had to suppress their feelings. And it's also symbolic in this wonderful scene that John, her cousin, it doesn't have to hide anything. He can be violent, he can express all of his emotions, he's even a bully to his mother, because ultimately he's going to have the power and the money, and she's not. And so Jane, we enter a world in which women have to hide their emotions, and men can be as violent in their emotions as they want to be. And Jane, who is an orphan, who is unloved, who is treated very badly by this aunt, Mrs. Reed, and by her cousins, has to figure out how to navigate in this world. And here we have John throwing the book at her, literally, and it seems to be the same book that was referred to in Persuasion, the book about women that is written by men. And remember in Persuasion where Anne basically says to Wentworth, he puts down the pen and he listens and he lets himself be penetrated by her pen. Traded by her. She picks up the pen and she says, I have authority to speak for women, not you. And it's time for women to speak for themselves and speak their history. And so here is John in Jane Eyre throwing that same book at Jane, and she's got to figure out how to navigate with her tremendously emotional, passionate feelings. She is more passionate than most women in this novel, and that's part of what makes her such a fine catch, if you will, even though she's plain. She's not the normal heroine that we're used to in our novels of the 19th century. So we see that I'm in chapter 4 now, where Jane has this wonderful opportunity to express her passion and her anger and her vengeance against Mrs. Reed. And boy, does she tell her off. It's one of the most amazing scenes in literature and the most satisfying emotionally, if you will. And at this point, Mrs. Reed tells her, go to your room, go back to the nursery. And Jane rather symbolically realizes there's no more nursery for her. She's not a child. She can't be a child anymore. In order to save herself, she must start taking control and navigating and governing the way she's going to live. Nobody else is going to do it for her. This Mrs. Reed is not a mother. She will not take care of her. So she has to grow up very quickly. And so she's very blunt. She says, I declare I do not love you. You're a mean and wicked woman. She says, shaking from head to foot, thrilled with ungovernable excitement, I continued, I'm glad you are no relation of mine. You treated me with miserable cruelty, watching me in agony and not saving me and helping me. People think you're a good woman. You are not a good woman. And I am telling you that now. And so Jane has this wonderful opportunity to tell off Mrs. Reed. And afterwards she says, the vengeance tasted good at first, but then it starts feeling like poison. And she says to herself, I would fain exercise some better faculty than that of fierce speaking. Fain find nourishment for some less fiendish feeling. And so she recognizes, I think she honors the feeling, but it's the presentation that she's worried about. The fierceness, I think, probably scares her a little bit, although she's not going to give up her passionate selfhood. And she's wondering, what shall I do? What shall I do? And at this moment, she runs into Bessie. Now, Bessie's the maid, and Bessie is as sharp-tongued as anybody, and she's sharp-tongued like Mrs. Reed. But Bessie happens to love Charlotte. And Charlotte learns something in this scene about governing her passions, and not governing in terms of repressing her passions, but learning how to say them in a way that will get her what she needs and that will create communion rather than conflict, although she's perfectly willing to get involved in conflict in order to save her life, which she has had to do. And Bessie is being sharp-tongued with her at this moment and snippy. And Charlotte says, she says, I was disposed to bask in her youthful lightness of heart. I just put my 2 arms around her and said, come, Bessie, don't scold. And what a difference between that and how she talked to Mrs. Reed. She's touching Bessie, she's speaking her true heart, and she's saying it in the kindest of tones. She's frank, she's honest, she says, you know, you're always snipping at me, how can I tell if you love me? And just in, 4 words, come, Bessie, 4 or 5 words, don't scold me. And the tone, something magical is happening in this moment in terms of emotion that Jane is learning. And because Jane has been vulnerable with Bessie and opened herself up and hugged her, she then can talk to Bessie, and Bessie can tell her the truth and say, you're always so scared. You're such a scared little chit. And, don't always dread people. There are people out there who, unlike Mrs. Reed, will love you for who you are. So don't let my snippy tone cover over the love I have for you. Recognize that everybody has these little quirks in their personalities, but that doesn't mean that you can't commune with them and find the love that you're looking for. And Charlotte is indeed looking for love.